But another kind of famous, iconic person who has not passed away is the Joker. So kind of the first thing I wanted us to get into for this podcast is there's a new Joker movie. It came out. I've actually already seen it. By the time this episode airs, the review for Joker #2 will be on the channel, so go check that out. But I thought we could talk a little bit about it, because this, take a time machine back to 4 years ago when the first Joker came out in 2019.
5 years ago.
Well, is it 5? 2020, 21, 2, 3, okay, 4, 5. It depends on what month it came out. Actually, I think it was both October. But it was one of the first reviews we did here at the Collision. Like the first movies I think it was like the third or fourth movie. The first
I'm still haunted by the Photoshop that your wife did for your face on that thumbnail. So if you go back on our YouTube channel, you can find that and also be haunted.
Yeah, if you weren't scared of clowns already, you will be after seeing that. But it was kind of the first, buzzword. The first, difficult, we did, The Lion King was the first review we did, and Downton Abbey, and, it was sort of the first, okay, this is, a big conversation to get into, because there was so much just buzz about that movie. Yeah. Outrage, controversy, and, just a lot of, fear, especially, within the Christian community of, and just, I think, even beyond that, but, is this movie about a villain? This is Batman without Batman.
Yeah.
It's violent, it's gritty, it's not sort of that fluffy comic book kind of movie and flighty, and is this going to inspire so much of violence? And there's just so much conversation that it became this cultural moment. For better, whether you like the movie or don't like the movie, or kind of fall somewhere like I did in the middle,
or haven't seen it still,
or haven't, or completely missed the cultural moment. It was, if nothing else, it was interesting. It sparked conversations that seemed like it did. I kind of both ignite a new sort of movement in Hollywood, but also just capture a lot of the sentiment in this in society at large. And it's interesting, in hindsight, obviously a lot of most of the trepidation proved, I think, predictably overblown.
Yeah.
The streets today aren't filled with a bunch of people in Joker makeup.
Yeah.
It didn't a lot of that kind
of... It didn't
outrage.
inspire this kind of real-world violence that was feared.
Yeah. Again, we all kind of knew that, because movies have never, statistically and all that stuff inspired that. But it has definitely sparked a trend, an interest in telling villain stories. Hey, what if we had these superhero movies, but without the hero? What if we just to pull up a couple, since if you sort of start with Joker in 2019, just a couple of the notable ones, Birds of Prey, the Harley Quinn movie in 2020, the 2 Venom movies, kind of more of an anti-hero maybe, Morbius, a villain, Suicide Squad villain, Black Adam in 2022 with Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson, kind of an anti-hero, traditionally has been a villain. The Penguin Show, which just, I think the first 2 episodes now are out, on a villain. This Joker movie, and then just coming up in later this year, a couple months, or later this month, Venom, The Last Dance, Kraven the Hunter, and then it was just I saw a report from the Hollywood Reporter that they just announced a Bane and Deathstroke movie. I think the 2 of those villains, you don't get 1 villain, you get 2 villains.
2 for the price of 1.
You got to get bigger and better. I don't think there's a date for that being announced, but so sort of what seemed pretty unique with the Joker isn't anymore. The idea of, can you tell a story about a villain without the hero even in the story? There's a whole Sony Spider-Man universe going on where Spider-Man's never showed up, with Morbius and the Venom movies, and and I think there's something to that, and we'll kind of get into is that okay? Because I think while none of those movies have necessarily been as controversial as the Joker movie, there's just a lot of them, and I think some of that fear and question as far as hey, as Christians, do we need, is it okay to have stories that are about bad guys doing bad things and kind of end there, with them doing bad things, or do we need heroes? Do we need more to that? What's just your initial thoughts on just sort of that trend of
I think it for one reveals maybe just a cynicism in our culture right now, or say the past 10 years or 5 years, and I think cynicism can sort of find its voice in movies like this, or at least an appetite for anti-hero or villain origin story movies. for whatever reason, I mean, I think, I don't know, maybe we all got sick of the sort of plucky Marvel movies, and then Marvel kind of got lazy at doing superhero movies, and they just got worse and worse and worse. And then these come along, and then, you know, you pair that with a bunch of cynical, jaded young people, and it lands, I think, in many respects. And so I think, I don't know, I think it reveals maybe an overall cynicism towards life, maybe, in our culture. And I think that's what I think drives a lot of this. It's just there still is, I think, just a real timidity when it comes to, you know, being too much of a hero, or having, you know, too much of like a pure good guy. Like almost everyone, I feel like they feel the need to sort of taint the hero in some way, if not make him, you know, or her, like almost an anti-hero. And so,
yeah, and I think in some sense too, like we were even talking before we started recording, like I feel like superhero movies, although like there's still going to be some big ones and stuff, and maybe it will have a resurgence. Like there were so many of them that they kind of ran their course, and like we'd explored, you know, like the, you know, who are you without your suit kind of storyline. You know, with great power comes great response. Like we explored those storylines, you know, so much that it was almost inevitable to, like, you know, well, what are we going to do now with these characters, sort of these iconic properties? And we still want Gotham, but we've done Batman this many times. Like, well, what if we explore the other side? Like, so I think there is, like you said, a lot of it is, I think the intrigue of it comes from this sort of cynicism and, you know, lack of, you know, kind of poo-pooing the idealistic Superman characters.
Yeah.
And then some of it, I think, is just, we need something fresh. And I guess now it's not necessarily fresh anymore.
Yeah, it's sort of like we've done all the angles of the superhero, or at least that's what it feels like. And then it's like, well, let's start looking around, and who else is in this universe that we can sort of exploit into a movie. And you know, and I think it's also, I mean, not to bring it all back to like studios trying to make money, which, I mean, that's what they're trying to do, but it's like we have these recognizable properties in Gotham or you know, Marvel stuff. You know, they want to milk that for all it's worth, and so it's like, well, you tell these sort of tangent, you know, rabbit trails over here about these lesser known villains or lesser known heroes, and you're still sort of in that world of Marvel or DC or whatever. And so I think partly it's just we need new stories, but we don't want to stray outside this world that we've built and this like cash machine that we have that is, you know, DC or Marvel. And so I think partly it's just that, like, hey, are there other stories we can tell in this universe?
And Hollywood's reactionary, because like I've said before, my hope, at least, unless it's terrible, is like James Gunn's upcoming Superman movie, which the initial like press for it is that it's sort of a return to the classic Superman. Like he's more noble and optimistic, and it's more like a heartfelt, you know, good is good kind of type movie. And if it's good, I feel like then we'll probably see less hero or villain movies and more like optimistic heroes. But one thing that hasn't changed necessarily is kind of Christian's response to that, to the villain stories, like sort of that, which I think was the most strongly felt with the first Joker movie, just because that was the most like, I mean, it was R-rated and it was, you know, very like socially conscious, and like it was the most like forceful, aggressive type of these movies. You know, like where Venom, he's like an anti-hero, but he's kind of goofy. Like where the Joker, I think, more like embodied sort of some of those fears about like how we tell stories, and if we need, you know, is it okay for Christians to enjoy like stories about bad guys? So I went back in because the Joker movie, as we're recording this, most people, it hasn't been released, you know, to the public yet, so there's not a whole lot of kind of Christian reviews and responses. So I went back to the first Joker movie because I know there was such a discussion about that, because I feel like the concerns that were raised remain relevant for like this movie. For instance, I got pulled from the site Plugged In, which is sort of focused on the families website, which is a great website. You know, not putting them down by any means, but kind of they ended their Joker review, which is a pretty negative review, with the line, "Joker begs for a hero. It gives us a clown. Gotham seeks salvation and finds only blood," which almost like succinctly, I think, sums up what we're getting at. Of like, you know, people need a hero, but if it's just giving you a villain, then like it's not giving you what you need. Like
Yeah.
it's missing something by focusing on like the blood, and like the violence and the villain rather than the salvation, like the light. And then kind of the other one that became like kind of went viral at the time was an article by Russell Moore, who is now the editor-in-chief for Christianity Today, the big Christian publication, where he wrote an article which said why I didn't see the Joker movie, and kind of unpacks like it's sort of it's like a review, but for a movie he hadn't seen.
Yeah.
So it's like why he chose not to see it, and he kind of went into depth with it. So to pull a couple things from that, he says, for me, the problem with unmitigated darkness in superhero stories is the mirror image of the problem of saccharine lightness in earlier versions of such stories. Neither rings true to our deepest intuitions. We live in a cosmos that is both enlightened by grace and fallen into horror, that both groans at the reign of death and is amazed by the presence of grace. When stories present both of the realities, we see something of what is already familiar but unexpressed within us. And kind of later on, he kind of gets into how the Joker movie differs from a lot of the classic Batman movies, and sort of how Alfred kind of was that compassion to Batman that the Joker lacked. And he says, what's important to the story is the trauma, honestly seen, but what's also important is the morality, the compassion, the presence, the grace. That's what movies like Joker miss, and that's why they don't fully live up to such stories from which they come. In The Darkest Night, we want stories that are honest about that darkness, but we also long to see a bat signal in The Dark Knight too, and to know that on the other end of that signal is hope. So again, it's a 5-year-old article, but I feel like that sentiment I've seen expressed. It's like he articulates it well, because that same mindset hasn't gone away. Of like, even as someone that reviews these movies, and like he talks to people on our channel about it, like sort of that hope of like, essentially the question like, do all movies need hope? Like, do all movies need, sort of like, all kind of the full gospel of like, there's bad, there's evil, there's suffering, there's depravity, but there's also, hope. There's also a chance. What is your initial takeaway from sort of these reviews, maybe just like this sort of sentiment as a whole?
Yeah. Well, I think especially the bit about Alfred and sort of how he was sort of this, in many ways, the saving grace of Batman. Like, were it not for Alfred, that Batman would end up like many of the villains that he ends up fighting. And I think that is sort of the point of a movie like Joker, is that it's not just that like the Joker is necessarily pure evil and like just this terrible villain, but I think it can expose like how does a villain become a villain in those ways, and maybe like someone like the Joker I think maybe is the best case of like pure crazy evil tyrant, but I think it's okay for movies to not have like depravity, the savior, and the grace and the hope at the end. I think it's okay because you can leave a movie feeling very hopeless and perhaps depressed about whatever the subject matter is, and I think it's okay, because I think that is the beginning of a conversation you can have with the people that you saw the movie with, or other people online or whatever. And I think it's okay. Like, I don't think every movie needs to have all of those aspects. And I think the problem is, I think as Christians, we're very much in a hurry to get to the hope part. And I think it's a good impulse. And I think it's a well-founded, I think, desire for obvious reasons. But I think it's okay also to linger in the despair and to truly see the horrors of a fallen world. Like, I don't think that is necessarily always a bad thing.
Yeah, and I think like because Russell Moore gets it in that article of like there's a problem with sort of either one of those extremes, like to have only the light and the hope without the darkness, which is a lot of faith-based stuff.
Right.
Is sort of the other side of the coin of like all just darkness and despair. And like I think the gospel, he's right, like, the gospel has both. Like that's the whole the crucifixion is sort of the despair, the depravity, the sin, and like the empty tomb is the other side of that coin. And like you need both those together, or you don't have the gospel. Like if Jesus died and didn't rise, then it's not the gospel. If Jesus sort of died or just rose, and like there's no sin and no sacrifice or price to be paid, like you also don't have the gospel. Like
Right.
the gospel is both. I think where we can get maybe get confused with like movies and stuff is like, but movies aren't like movies reflect the gospel, but like movies, especially ones made by like mainstream Hollywood, like they're not the gospel.
Right.
Like, they don't need to have the full, like they're reflecting aspects of our experience, and part of our experience is hopefulness, and there's movies that are very hopeful, and part of our experience is like despair and life's bad, and things are not like they should be, and like that kind of healthy, I think, like righteous discontent within us, like, and I think movies like Joker 1 and 2 reflect that side of it. Like, things are, and I think almost even more so the second one, like that there's, that things sort of aren't as they should be, and there's just not answers, even in like our villainy or in our sin, like there's not answers that we in the world. Like we need something else. It's just the movie doesn't give you that answer, and like you said, I think it's almost like a Christian mindset thing of we're not as comfortable with that because we want to be comforted rather than challenged, and like which I think why a lot of like faith-based movies and stuff just aren't challenging. Like I think that's my issue with a lot of it is it's just like it makes you feel good, but it doesn't like kind of shake you or give you a reason why you want to feel good. Like it's this like cheap therapy of like things are fine, don't worry about it, but like they're going to be even better than fine, and you're okay, and like I think there's a place for that. But at a certain point, it's like, but like, why do we need the good news? Like, what is this answer? Like, what's the question that this is answering?
Yeah.
And like movies like a Joker or other kind of these type, or I think like Scorsese's Killers of the Flower Moon was a good one that I saw recently of just like shaking you a bit of, okay, things are bad. Like this is why we need it. And like letting you process and dwell on that for a bit before sort of shortchanging it and like skipping over to the good stuff.
Yeah, because I think when you leave viewers with that sort of unsettledness, I think it can drive people to go and look for those answers or to just at least discuss that. And I think that can be some of the power of film is that you're not just spoon feeding a worldview or answers to the audience. And I think it's a show of respect to the audience when like you don't, tie up all the bows and tidy up all the loose ends. Is it like, hey, the world's messy, the ending's messy or whatever. And it's okay. And you can now go and process that. And I think having the non-answer at the end of the film can do a lot of heavy lifting, I think, if we sort of trust that process and respect audiences enough to say, like people can come to their own conclusions at the end of this. And it's not like, because I think when you don't do that, then it just becomes like, the conversation is more about the solution that's offered at the end. And then you can kind of quibble about that. Whereas I think just leaving the problem on the table can be a lot more powerful, and I think can lead to better communication and better understanding with the audiences than just, give them an answer at the end and now it's just, well, we're debating that answer rather than unpacking all of it.
Or even just like letting you off the hook. Like I think one of the things that makes, which again, you can check my review. I'm not crazy about, either of the Joker movies. The Joker 2 is an interesting one to me because I feel like it works better like as like a movie to talk about than it is like an enjoyable movie to see. But like part of I think what it has going in its favor is like there isn't Batman at the end to like let you off the hook. Like it's not like things are bad, but don't worry. Like people like Batman take care of these problems. Like it very much exposes sort of what led Joker to this point and like just the societal influence and the broken systems we have and just that need for love and how in our like fickle society and stuff like people don't they just want to use you for their own purposes and like and then it leaves that as the problem and it's like, well, Batman didn't show up to fix it. Like, so what do we do about a culture that's like this? And like you can make clear parallels. And I think kind of another thing with the movies too is that I think there's a difference between like expecting a movie I guess like receiving a movie or like using a movie of like kind of expecting the movie to sort of like just deliver you the answer. Like this is sort of the worldview, and then we judge whether we agree with that or not. Where I think a movie can also, like, Christians can benefit from watching movies that don't align with our worldview. Like maybe this Joker world is just like pure nihilism and meaningless, and like, but as a Christian we know that's not true, and we can kind of engage with it on that level.
Yeah.
Even though the movie itself isn't necessarily, like we don't need movies to reflect our own worldview in order to have thoughtful worldview conversations about movies, because most movies won't reflect kind of that Christian worldview. But I am interested to see sort of what comes from this movie. Like if the discussion, like it doesn't seem like it's as buzzy as the first one. Maybe we just want to like retread that road. But I'll be interested to see sort of how Christians respond to this movie, and just how the general public responds to it. But one movie that